in this photo of what seemed like a simple but happy house. The Dardeen family's home in Ena, Illinois, became the scene of a brutal tragedy. In 1987, a pregnant woman was savagely beaten to death so violently that she went into labor during the attack. But she wasn't the only one. The entire family, including the young child in that photo, suffered the same horrific fate. This is, without a doubt, one of the most disturbing cases I've ever covered on this channel. And trust me, anyone who's looked into this case would say the same thing. Stick with us, and you'll soon see exactly why it's so haunting. To really understand the Dardeen family and the events that would follow, let's rewind to 1986. That's when 29-year-old Russell Keith Dardeen and his wife Ruby Elaine Dardeen moved to the tiny town of Ena, Illinois, with their 2-year-old son, Peter. By the way, they both preferred to go by their middle names, Keith and Elaine. Now, the Dardeens had settled into a beige and white mobile home on a piece of land right by Route 37. The Illinois Central Railroad tracks were just across the highway. Elaine, who was pregnant with their second child, a daughter they planned to name Casey, had a lot going on. Keith worked as a treatment plant operator, while Elaine worked at an office supply store. They were a tight-knit family, super active in their local Baptist church, and even played in the musical ensemble. Despite their modest lifestyle, the couple was deeply committed to their son Peter's future, and a significant portion of their money went into his college fund, even though he was only 2 at the time. Keith was so dedicated to his family that he even bought Kroger soda cans and resold them for 50 cents each. From this point of view, you could really tell that Keith was a family man, and all their neighbors would vouch for that. According to them, Keith and Elaine were always involved in the community, and everything seemed to be going well for the young family. It looked like life was on track for them to live happily ever after in their quiet corner of Illinois. But things in the neighborhood weren't as peaceful as they seemed. Around this time, there had been a disturbing rise in crime in Jefferson County, which had a population of about 38,577. In just the last 2 years, there had been a shocking 15 murders, including the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl in May of 1987. And it wasn't just the recent crimes that were concerning. Ena, the town where the Dardeen lived, had its own dark history. There was a chilling case in 1924, where 2 people were murdered by their spouses through arsenic poisoning. Then, in 1985, a man murdered his entire family while high on LSD. With all of this happening in and around the area, Keith couldn't ignore the rising tension. He felt uneasy about raising his family in a place that was becoming more dangerous by the day, especially with a new baby on the way. At one point, Keith told his mother that he and Elaine were planning to move back to Mount Carmel, Illinois, where he had grown up. He didn't give a specific reason, but it was clear that he was worried about the future. He even said it didn't matter whether he found a job there or not. He was determined to move back. After Keith mentioned that to his mom, she thought it was a little strange, especially considering how focused the family had been on saving money. A move like that would be expensive, and it didn't really line up with the couple's usual careful planning. But Keith was determined. In fact, he even put their mobile home up for sale that same year. His desire to protect his family had only grown stronger, and it showed in his actions. One example that stood out was when he turned away a woman who came knocking on their door asking to use the phone. His protective instincts were clearly on high alert, but it left you wondering, what was making him so uneasy. 18th November 1987, when it's been several days since Keith failed to show up for work. As we've mentioned, Keith had always been reliable and did everything he could to save and earn money. So, when he didn't show up for work that day, his boss immediately became concerned. He tried calling the house, but no one picked up. That's when he decided to reach out to Keith's parents, but they hadn't heard anything from the family either. At this point, everyone was on edge. So, they decided it was time to call the police. The officers arrived at the mobile home and knocked on the door, but once again, there was no answer. One officer peered through the window and saw people lying still on the bed under the blankets, but they weren't moving. Things were starting to feel off, so the police tried to open the door. With a simple twist of the knob, they were about to uncover one of the most horrifying scenes. When the officers opened the door, they discovered the lifeless bodies of Elaine, her son Peter, and a tiny infant all lying beneath blankets. Both Elaine and Peter were both bound and gagged with duct tape, their bodies beaten so brutally that Elaine had gone into labor and given birth to a baby girl during the attack. Even more heartbreaking is that their skulls were crushed because of the savage blows they've received. But the horror didn't stop there. The killer, or killers, showed no mercy. They went as far as to beat the newborn to death with a baseball bat. Interestingly, the bat was owned by the family, and it was a gift that Keith had given Peter earlier that year. When the police witnessed the scene, they were left in complete shock. Many officers, who had witnessed their fair share of horrific crime scenes, were visibly shaken by the brutality of what they saw. One of the most puzzling aspects was the lack of forced entry into the home, which ruled out the theory of a random robbery gone wrong. There were valuable items inside, things that could have easily been taken, but nothing was disturbed. Everything was still in its place. Even more perplexing was the fact that Elaine hadn't been sexually assaulted, which made the motive even harder to pinpoint. The killer had even attempted to clean up the blood, but it was determined that they had given up halfway through. This detail suggested the killer had time on their hands, showing no signs of urgency. They weren't worried about being interrupted or caught, so whoever did this had all the time in the world to carry out their horrific plan. But what about Keith, the father? When the police arrived, he was nowhere to be found in the trailer, and the family's car was missing too. It didn't take long for the police to start suspecting that Keith might have killed his family and fled the scene. However, when the neighbors first heard about the possibility of Keith being responsible for the murders, it didn't sit right with them. A search team of law enforcement officers was quickly assigned to look for him. But just as quickly as the search had been launched, it was called off. Keith's body was discovered by a group of hunters in a wheat field, not far from the family's home the following day. He had been shot 3 times in the head, a clear sign of an execution-style assassination. But the most shocking detail of all was that his genital appendage had been removed. Some accounts even suggested that the killer had stuffed it into Keith's mouth. This twisted act is a chilling indication that the killer was no ordinary criminal, but rather someone with the mind of a twisted psychopath capable of unimaginable brutality. It's also easy to guess that the killer had some experience, or maybe they had a serious personal vendetta against the family. As the investigation unfolded, officers pieced together that Keith was most likely killed in the family car, meaning the killer or killers must have driven him there. The blood found inside the vehicle ruled out the idea that Keith was murdered in the house. It was also determined that all the victims were killed within an hour of each other. Once the news spread, the town was on edge. They'd already been dealing with rising crime, but this case took things to a whole new level of unease. The family was well liked, had no known enemies, and suddenly there were no suspects. This left everyone wondering who could do something this brutal to a seemingly perfect family. Remember, there was no forced entry into the home, and the doors were left unlocked, so a robbery didn't seem to be the motive. Keith's gruesome sexual mutilation added more confusion, especially since there was no sign of sexual assault on Elaine. Additionally, no evidence was found to suggest any extramarital affairs, financial troubles, or any apparent grudges against the Dardeen family. While there was a trace of marijuana found in the house, there was no solid proof that they were involved in drug dealing or even used drugs, so investigators assumed it likely belonged to the killer. That's when Keith's mother, Joanne, floated a theory. Maybe someone had tried to pressure Keith into selling drugs, or maybe Elaine had turned down someone's advances. And the killer lashed out in retaliation. This idea led the police to explore different possibilities, even considering the bizarre suggestion that a satanic cult might have been behind the murders, trying to appease the devil. However, experts in cults and ritual killings quickly dismissed this theory, saying there were no signs of cult activity. With little to go on and no clear suspects, the police were left to focus on a theory. The killer must have somehow gained entry into the Dardeen home, taken Keith out, and murdered him somewhere else. Afterward, they returned to the house, tied up Peter and Elaine, and killed them both, along with Elaine's newborn baby girl. But despite this theory, the investigation seemed to hit a dead end. No one seemed to have a real lead, and the case was slipping further and further into the cold file pile. Additionally, it seemed like everyone had given up on solving this gruesome crime. But Keith's mother, Joanne, wasn't ready to let the case fade into obscurity. She wasn't going to let the brutality of what happened to her family be forgotten. She took matters into her own hands, gathering over 3,000 signatures in an effort to get the Oprah Winfrey Show to cover the case. Unfortunately, her request was denied because the producers claimed that the crime was just too brutal for daytime television. But Joanne didn't give up. Her next move was to try to get the case featured on America's Most Wanted. At first, the producers reacted the same way as Oprah's team, but after some persuasion, they agreed to do a segment on the murders. In 1998, the show aired the segment. However, despite the high-profile attention, it didn't lead to any new leads or breakthroughs. The police were no closer to solving the murders than they had been back in 1987. Then, after 12 years of nothing, the police finally got a break. They received a lead on a possible suspect named Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was a well-known serial killer, linked to over 22 murders across the United States. Though he claimed to have killed over 70 people, his past was filled with trauma and darkness that seemed to follow him everywhere. Born into a tragic childhood, Tommy and his twin sister both contracted spinal meningitis when they were just 18 months old. While Tommy survived, his sister tragically passed away. Growing up, Tommy was without much guidance and didn't have anyone to turn to. His early years were marked by neglect and trauma. He began abusing substances at the young age of 7, a sign of the pain he was trying to escape. When Tommy was still a young boy, a man from a nearby town befriended him. On the surface, this man appeared to be someone who genuinely wanted to help a boy without any support. He would give Tommy gifts, take him out, and let him stay at his house. It wasn't until later that the disturbing truth came to light. The man was eventually convicted of child molestation, with Tommy being one of his victims. From the age of 8, Tommy had been abused by this man, a trauma that would go on to shape the twisted path of his life. By the age of 10, Tommy Lynn Sells had dropped out of school entirely, spending most days experimenting with smoking and drinking. At 13, after a troubling incident with his grandmother, Sells' mother, upset and alarmed, decided to leave with his siblings, leaving Tommy to fend for himself. From that point on, Sells had no family or stable home. He began drifting from town to town, finding ways to survive by doing odd jobs and taking what he needed to get by. Unfortunately, he started showing violent tendencies with one early incident where he attacked a young woman, leaving her badly shaken. Sells later claimed that his first murder happened when he was just 16. He said he broke into a house and attacked a man who he alleged was harming a young boy, though no evidence was ever found to back up this story. Later, Sells also claimed he killed a man named John Cade Sr. in July of 1979, after Cade reportedly caught him breaking into his home. After that, Sells led a life constantly on the move, jumping from town to town, sneaking rides on trains, and stealing to get by. Then, in the year 2000, Sells was arrested in Del Rio, Texas, after a horrifying attack on 2 young girls, 13-year-old Kayleen Harris, and while he was being held, Sells confessed to killing the Dardeen family too. But his account was sketchy at best, and he kept changing his story. In 2 different versions, he claimed to have met Keith Dardeen, first at a truck stop and then at a pool hall. In both stories, Sells said Keith invited him over for dinner. He said, what started as a casual visit soon turned into something darker when Keith allegedly made a sexual proposition to Sells. According to Sells, Keith's offer sparked his rage, and he decided to take it out on Keith. Sells forced Keith to drive him to a secluded area where he killed and mutilated him, then returned to the trailer to kill the other witnesses, Elaine and young Peter, out of rage that he said had no stop button. In another version of events, Sells didn't mention the sexual proposition at all. Instead, he claimed he simply saw the for sale sign on the Dardeen's trailer and saw an opportunity for violence. After drinking some beers and waiting for the right moment, he knocked on the door and pretended to be interested in buying the trailer. When Keith opened the door, Sells overpowered him, bound and gagged his family with duct tape, and forced Keith to drive to a field. There, he brutally castrated Keith before shooting him. He then returned to the trailer, raped Elaine, and killed Peter and the newborn before cleaning up the scene and driving Keith's car to Benton. As you can see, many of his statements didn't line up with official records, and despite his confession, investigators couldn't find a shred of physical evidence tying him to the Dardeen family's murder. But Sells tried to explain away these doubts by saying, "They say there's no physical evidence tying me to Dardeens, but there wasn't for any of them because they weren't looking for me. I moved. I was always a transient." So, to see if he was actually telling the truth, the investigators of Illinois wanted to bring Sells to their state to see if he could help them find critical evidence or show that he knew specific details about the crime scene. They hoped this would prove whether he was telling the truth or just making things up. But there was a catch. Texas law prohibits death row inmates from being moved to another state. Illinois officials tried to get an exception, hoping to bring Sells in for further questioning, but their request was denied. Without any concrete evidence linking Sells to the Dardeen murders, Illinois authorities ultimately decided not to pursue charges. Now, the doubts surrounding Sells' confession didn't only come from law enforcement. Friends and family of Keith Dardeen, the man Sells claimed to have met before the murders, also raised concerns about his story. They found it hard to believe that Keith, fully aware of the dangerous situation in the area due to years of violent killings, would invite a stranger into his home for dinner. A friend of Keith's remarked, if he wouldn't let a young girl in to use the phone, he wouldn't let a 22-year-old man in. Sells' claim that Keith made a homosexual advance toward him also seemed suspicious. This didn't line up with what anyone knew about Keith's character. He had never shown any interest in men, and the police investigation didn't find any evidence to support Sells' claim. Detectives who spoke with Sells suspected that he fabricated this detail to make the crime seem more justified in his mind. Sells often used similar tactics when confessing to other murders, claiming that the victims had provoked him in some way, making it easier for him to justify his actions. As investigators dug deeper into Sells' confessions, it became increasingly clear that his story wasn't adding up. His details were often inconsistent, and as time passed, it became harder to believe he was truly responsible for the Dardeen murders. It seemed like Sells was trying to take credit for these killings, along with many others, just to manipulate the legal system and make himself seem more dangerous or important. In the end, even though Sells confessed to more than 70 murders and was linked to over 22, he was only convicted of one: the murder of Kayleen Harris. On April 4th, 2014, he was executed by lethal injection for that crime, with no conviction tied to the Dardeen murders. So, despite everything, the Dardeen family murders remain officially unsolved. The lack of solid evidence linking Sells to the crime leaves plenty of room for doubt, and many questions about what really happened that night are still up in the air. One of the biggest mysteries is the brutal nature of the murders. The violence used on the Dardeen family, especially Elaine and her children, seemed excessively cruel, even for someone like Sells. Some investigators have wondered if the killer might have had a personal connection to the family, but no evidence has ever surfaced to back that up. Another question that remains unanswered is the timeline of the murders. Did Keith come home to find the killer already there, or was he taken hostage during the attack? The fact that there was no forced entry suggests that the family might have known their killer, but without any solid leads. This is still just a theory. Do you believe Sells was really the one who killed the family? Or do you agree with what law enforcement and Keith's family have said, that he might not have been the killer after all?